Hello, lovely people. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about Pol Pot and his reign of power alongside the Cambodian genocide that was a result of the Khmer Rouge regime. Today's subject matter is going to be quite heavy. I'm just going to get this out of the way off the bat. We are going to be talking about physical torture, psychological torture, and other forms of violence. I'm not going to focus the video entirely on those subject matter, but I just wanted to give a fair warning. If you are sensitive to those subjects, please click off of today's video. The next video will hopefully be a lot more lighthearted. I have something fun kind of planned out. But for the purposes of today's video, I just want to give you a fair warning about that. It is not light subject matter by any means. The Khmer Rouge effectively killed approximately 1.5 to 2 million Cambodian citizens, nearly a quarter of the population at the time. And my purposes of creating today's video is that I often see atrocities such as the killing of Nanking in China, Unit 731 in Japan, the Holocaust generally talked about quite a bit, but I don't see a ton talked about in terms of the Khmer Rouge's regime and the Cambodian genocide. And I think it's incredibly important to remember for all of the victims lost and the families that will never see their relatives or have permanently been changed in terms of lineage. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the subject matter of today's video. Once again, please be aware that there are very sensitive topics talked about in today's video. So if you would not like to hear that, I completely understand. Given the socioeconomic status of the world at the moment, go watch something lighthearted if you aren't doing well mentally. Anyways, that's enough of me rambling. Let's get started. Most people grow up learning about the Holocaust. They learn about Nazi Germany, concentration camps, and the political circumstances that led up to World War II. Images of barbed wire, train cars, prison uniforms have become enduring symbols of one of the darkest chapters in modern history, but far fewer people know about what happened in Cambodia. Fewer people recognize the name Pol Pot. Between 1975 and 1979, just 50-ish years ago, Cambodia experienced one of the most devastating episodes of mass violence in the 20th century. Historians estimate that between 1.5 and 2 million people died during those 4 years, nearly a quarter of the country's population at the time. Some were executed, but many more died from starvation, disease, and exhaustion in forced labor camps. Entire families disappeared, communities were dismantled, cities were emptied, and schools closed. Money virtually disappeared from everyday life. The Khmer Rouge abolished Cambodia's currency, closed banks, and eliminated markets. To the Khmer Rouge, money represented inequality and corruption. As a result, when the country was taken over, it was reorganized into collective farming communes where food and resources were distributed by the state. In just a few years, Cambodian society was reorganized into a radical agricultural system unlike anything attempted before. And this transformation did not occur gradually, it happened almost overnight. The violence that was not the result of a foreign occupation or an invading army. It emerged from within Cambodia itself, carried out by a revolutionary government that claimed it was building an entirely new society. At the center of that project was a man who rarely appeared in public and whose name was unfamiliar to most Cambodians at the time, Pol Pot. The movement he led, known as the Khmer Rouge, would attempt to dismantle Cambodia's existing society and rebuild it from the ground up. To understand how Cambodia reached that point, we have to begin decades earlier, long before the Khmer Rouge came to power. Pol Pot was born Sola Sar in 1925 in rural Cambodia. At the time, Cambodia was part of the French Indochina, a colonial territory administered by France. Colonial rule shaped much of Cambodia's political and economic life during the early 20th century. French authorities controlled major institutions while local elites worked within the colonial system. Sar's family was relatively comfortable compared to many Cambodian farmers. They owned rice fields and had modest connections to the Cambodian royal court. As a teenager, Sar moved to Phnom Penh, Cambodia's capital, to attend school. Teachers later described him as quiet and polite. Academically, he was considered an average student. Nothing about his early life suggested that he would eventually lead one of the most radical political movements in the 20th century. But in the late 1940s, Sar received a scholarship to study in Paris, and this experience would allegedly influence his political thinking profoundly. After World War II, Paris was a center of political debate. Students from across the colonial world gathered there. Many of them came from countries still under European rule. Conversations about independence, socialism, and revolution were common. While studying radio electronics, Salazar became involved with communist student circles. He read the works of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and other socialist thinkers. These ideas attracted many young intellectuals who believed that colonial systems and economic inequality needed to be replaced with new political structures. Sar eventually joined a small Cambodian communist organization in Paris. However, his academic studies did not go well. He failed several exams and lost his scholarship. In 1953, he returned to Cambodia, but by then his political outlook had changed. He no longer saw Cambodia simply as a traditional society. He saw it as a country that needed to be completely transformed. Around the same time, in 1953, Cambodia gained independence from France. The country was ruled by Norodom Sihanouk. I hope I'm saying that correct. I will put all pronunciations up on screen. But Sihanouk later stepped down from the throne, yet continued to dominate Cambodian politics. Sihanouk attempted to maintain neutrality during the Cold War, but Cambodia was also located next to one of the most violent conflicts of the era, the Vietnam War. So this is kind of where that history of the Vietnam War interlaces with Cambodian history, as North Vietnamese forces used parts of eastern Cambodia as supply routes. And in response, the United States launched bombing campaigns inside Cambodian territory beginning in 1969. Unfortunately, these bombings destroyed villages and displaced large numbers of rural residents. At the same time, Cambodia faced internal political tensions, corruption, economic inequality, and political repression created dissatisfaction among many rural communities. Communist organizers began building support in remote areas of the countryside. These groups would later form the foundation of the movement known as the Khmer Rouge. By 1970, Cambodia's political situation changed drastically. While King Norodom Sihanouk was traveling abroad, a military leader named Lon Nol carried out a coup and removed him from power. Seemingly overnight, Cambodia was transformed into a republic aligned with the United States. The coup managed to destabilize the country almost immediately, and civil war broke out. On one side was a new government led by Lon Nol, backed by the United States, and on the other side was a growing communist insurgency operating in the countryside. From exile, the deposed King Sihanouk made a surprising decision. He publicly called on Cambodians to join the insurgency against Lon Nol's government. Because Sihanouk was still deeply respected by many rural Cambodians, his support dramatically increased recruitment for the rebel communist movement. And that movement became known as, once again, the Khmer Rouge. Many Cambodians who joined did not necessarily support communist ideology. They were responding to Sihanouk's call, or simply were exhausted by years of war and instability. But while ordinary fighters believed that they were defending the nation and restoring the king, the movement was actually controlled by a small secretive leadership. At the center of that leadership was a man using a new name. His birth name was Salazar, and the world would eventually come to know him as Pol Pot. By the mid 1970s, Cambodia's civil war had devastated the country. Cities were filled with refugees fleeing fighting in rural areas. Food shortages became common, and government control weakened. On April 17th, 1975, Khmer Rouge forces entered Phnom Penh. For many Cambodians, the arrival of the insurgents seemed like the end of years of conflict. Some residents even celebrated, but within hours, the new authorities began issuing orders. The entire population of Phnom Penh was told to leave the city. People were told that American bombing was imminent and that the evacuation would last only a few days. Hospitals were emptied, patients were forced to walk out of their beds, families gathered what belongings they could carry, and nearly 2 million people were pushed out of Phnom Penh and onto roads leading into the countryside. Within days, one of Southeast Asia's largest cities was almost completely empty. The evacuation was not temporary, it was part of a radical plan to reorganize Cambodian society. Once the Khmer Rouge took power, they declared Cambodia had entered year zero. The leadership believed that the country needed to start from the beginning. Money was abolished, banks were destroyed, markets closed, and schools and universities shut down. Religion was also banned, and private property no longer existed. Cities were viewed as symbols of corruption and inequality. The regime believed that Cambodia should become a completely agricultural society, that everyone should work collectively on farms. Urban residents who had lived under the previous government were labeled new people. Rural villagers who had supported the revolution were called base people. These labels shaped daily life. New people were often assigned the hardest labor and received smaller food rations. The regime believed that through physical work and ideological training, society could be reshaped. And this is where we get into a little bit more of the graphic details of life under the Khmer Rouge. Life under the Khmer Rouge was controlled down to the smallest details. Most Cambodians were forced to work between 12 and 16 hours a day. They dug irrigation canals, built dams, and planted rice. Tools were very primitive, food was scarce, and rations often consisted of thin rice porridge. Malnutrition spread quickly, medical care was extremely limited, and even minor illnesses could become fatal. The regime also attempted to reshape social relationships. Children were often separated from their parents and placed in youth groups. They were taught that their loyalty should belong to the revolution rather than their family. Suspicion became a part of daily life. People were encouraged to report anyone suspected of disloyalty. Speaking a foreign language could attract attention. Owning books could raise suspicion. In some cases, simply wearing glasses suggested that a person was educated and therefore politically unreliable. Thousands of people were executed for reasons like these. Beyond executions in prisons, many Cambodians died in the labor camps themselves. The Khmer Rouge forced millions of people into agricultural work brigades where conditions were extremely harsh. Workdays often lasted, as previously said, 12 to 16 hours, sometimes longer during planting and harvesting seasons. People were required to dig irrigation canals, clear forests, and construct dams using simple hand tools. Sleep was extremely limited. Workers were often woken before dawn and required to attend ideological meetings late into the night. Many people suffered from severe malnutrition, which weakened their immune systems and made disease more deadly. Again, medical care was almost non existent. Traditional medicines were sometimes banned, and trained doctors had largely disappeared, fleeing after being targeted by the regime. Conditions inside the labor camps themselves were also quite abusive beyond what was already mentioned. Prisoners and laborers could be punished for minor infractions such as working too slowly, speaking without permission, or sleeping when they weren't allowed to. Some survivors later described being forced to work while partially clothed or naked, especially during punishments meant to humiliate and intimidate them. People accused of violating rules were often beaten publicly as a warning to others. Guards used sticks, rifle butts, bamboo poles, and farming tools. Flogging and repeated beatings were common forms of punishment in labor camps. Many prisoners were tied or shackled for long periods of time, sometimes with their hands bound behind their back. Others were forced to remain in painful positions during interrogations or while guards questioned them. In some cases, prisoners were suspended or restrained during questioning, a method intended to exhaust them physically and mentally. Public humiliation was also part of the system. Prisoners could be forced to stand before groups of workers and admit to supposed crimes against the revolution. These sessions reinforced the idea that anyone could be accused at any time. For many Cambodians, the constant threat of punishment became part of daily life. People learned quickly that even minor actions, speaking out of term, questioning a rule, or appearing insufficiently enthusiastic about the revolution could result in severe consequences. Women were particularly vulnerable. Survivor testimonies in later investigations documented cases of sexual violence and forced marriages arranged by the regime. In many areas, exhaustion itself became a cause of death. People collapsed from overwork, malnutrition, and lack of sleep. For many Cambodians, the labor camps functioned as places where survival was uncertain. Not everyone was executed, but under these conditions, many people simply did not live long enough to escape them. One of the most infamous places created by the Khmer Rouge was Security Prison 21, often called S-21. The prison was located in Phnom Penh, inside a former high school building. Today, the site is known as the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum. At S-21, prisoners were interrogated by the regime's security forces. Many were accused of betraying the revolution. Others were victims of internal purges within the Khmer Rouge itself. Prisoners were tortured until they signed confessions. These confessions often described elaborate conspiracies involving foreign governments, and once the confessions were completed, prisoners were transported to execution sites outside of the city. These locations later became known as the killing fields. Mass graves were discovered across the Cambodian countryside. Thousands of burial sites have since been identified, and when investigators began uncovering these locations in the late 1970s and 1980s, they found mass graves scattered across the Cambodian countryside. At sites like Loung Ung, thousands of human remains were recovered from the earth. Today, many of these remains are preserved in memorial stupas. Visitors to these sites often see glass towers filled with human skulls, physical evidence of the scale of the violence that occurred during those 4 years. Some of the photographs taken by these locations have become widely known. Images of stacked skulls, shallow graves, and the remnants of clothing found in the soil have become some of the most haunting visual records of the Cambodian genocide. By the late 1970s, the Khmer Rouge leadership had become increasingly paranoid. Pol Pot believed enemies were everywhere, both outside Cambodia and within their own movement. In their view, the revolution was constantly under threat from spies, traitors, and foreign powers. Some of these fears were connected to real geopolitical tensions. Cambodia had a long and complicated relationship with their neighboring country, Vietnam, and ideological disputes had emerged between the two communist governments. But the Khmer Rouge leadership also began to suspect betrayal from within its own ranks. Officials who had served the revolution for years were suddenly accused of working for foreign intelligence agencies such as the CIA, the KGB, or Vietnamese communists. These accusations were often unsupported by evidence. Instead, they reflected the leadership's growing distrust and rigid belief that any failure of the revolution must be the result of sabotage. As a result, internal purges intensified, entire regional party organizations were dismantled, thousands of Khmer Rouge members, including military commanders and senior officials, were arrested, imprisoned, and executed. Many of them, ironically, were sent to Security Prison 21, where they were forced to sign confessions describing elaborate conspiracies against the regime. Some of the people targeted during these purges had been among the most loyal supporters of the revolution. The purges weakened the regime from within, creating an atmosphere where even high-ranking officials feared that they could be arrested at any time. Pol Pot's actions reflected a leadership that had become increasingly isolated, paranoid, and suspicious, convinced that the revolution could not only survive through constant vigilance, but through the elimination of perceived enemies. At the same time, tensions with neighboring Vietnam continued escalating, border clashes grew more violent, and in late 1978, tensions between Cambodia and Vietnam escalated into open war. For several years, the Khmer Rouge had carried out attacks along the Vietnamese border. The Cambodian leadership believed Vietnam was attempting to dominate the region and undermine the revolution. Vietnam, however, viewed the Khmer Rouge government as increasingly hostile and unstable. In December 1978, Vietnam launched a large-scale military invasion of Cambodia. The Vietnamese army moved quickly compared with the exhausted and poorly organized Khmer Rouge forces. Vietnam's military at the time was far larger, better equipped, and experienced after decades of war. Within weeks, the Khmer Rouge defenses began to collapse. By early January 1979, Vietnamese troops entered Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge leadership abandoned the capital and retreated west toward the Thai border. Pol Pot and senior officials escaped into remote jungle areas near Thailand, where remnants of the movement continued operating for years. Although the Khmer Rouge had lost control of the country, the conflict did not immediately end. Guerrilla fighting continued throughout the 1980s, with Khmer Rouge forces launching attacks from bases along the Cambodian-Thai border. Inside Cambodia, a new government backed by Vietnam attempted to rebuild the country after years of devastation. The fall of Phnom Penh in January 1979 effectively ended the Khmer Rouge's rule, but the political and socioeconomic consequences of the regime would continue to shape Cambodia for decades. The devastation left behind by the regime was enormous. Cities were nearly emptied, infrastructure had collapsed largely, hospitals, schools, and government institutions had been abandoned or completely destroyed. Large parts of Cambodia's educated population had fled or been killed. Doctors, teachers, engineers, lawyers, and administrators had disappeared during the Khmer Rouge years. In many cases, simply having an education had been enough to make someone a target. So when the regime fell in 1979, Cambodia faced the difficult task of rebuilding a functioning society with very few trained professionals remaining. Families also faced the challenge of finding missing relatives. Mass graves were discovered along the countryside. Many victims were never formally identified. The political situation after the fall of the Khmer Rouge was also complicated. Vietnam established a new government in Cambodia, but the country remained deeply entangled in Cold War politics. Some foreign governments continued to oppose Vietnam's presence, and for years the Khmer Rouge remained active as a guerrilla force along the Thai border. Because of these political divisions, efforts to prosecute the Khmer Rouge leaders moved slowly. Pol Pot himself was never tried for genocide. He remained in remote jungle areas near the Thai border for nearly 2 decades. The Khmer Rouge gradually weakened during the 1990s as members defected or surrendered. In 1997, Pol Pot was placed under house arrest by his own remaining followers during an internal power struggle. He died the following year, in 1998, before any international court could try him. It was not until the early 2000s that Cambodia and the United Nations established a special tribunal known as the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. This court was created specifically to prosecute senior Khmer Rouge officials responsible for the atrocities of the 1970s. So, although Pol Pot was never formally convicted, several former leaders were eventually convicted. Among them were Nuon Chia, often described as Pol Pot's second in command, and Kyo Samphan, the former head of state of the Democratic Kampuchea. Both were found guilty of crimes against humanity and genocide decades after the regime had fallen. But by the time these trials occurred, many of the victims and witnesses had already passed away. Today, Cambodia continues to live with the legacy of these 4 years. Memorial sites such as the Cheong Ek killing fields preserve evidence of the violence. These sites are places of remembrance and education, as nearly every Cambodian family lost someone, whether that be a friend, a family member, an acquaintance, during the Khmer Rouge era. The Cambodian genocide remains one of the most devastating episodes of the 20th century, yet it is often less widely discussed than other genocides and atrocities. Remembering it matters because it demonstrates how quickly a society can crumble and be completely transformed when radical ideology combines with absolute political power. In just 4 years, Cambodia lost nearly a quarter of its population, and the consequences of that moment are still visible today. The effects of this period still shape the country today. Many survivors continue to share their stories, helping historians and future generations understand what exactly happened. And this is just my personal take, but we often hear the phrase, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So, regardless, even if you aren't exactly connected to the genocide, I think it's extremely important to learn more about it and to recognize the circumstances leading up to it. If you would like to learn more about the Cambodian genocide, several books and documentaries provide deeper insight into this history. One widely recommended book is First They Killed My Father, Loung Ung, a memoir describing the experience of a child surviving the Khmer Rouge regime. Another is Voices from S-21 by historian David Chandler, which examines the records and confessions produced inside the infamous prisons. The documentary Enemies of the People, directed by Thet, Sambath, and Rob Lemkin, explores how the killings were carried out and includes rare interviews with former Khmer Rouge officials. Studying these atrocities and history can be quite difficult, but it's also extremely important to remember. Nonetheless, thank you all for watching. If you made it this far into the video, my channel focuses on history and figures not often covered by people today. I'm sure many of you watching have heard of the Khmer Rouge by proximity to Vietnam. Before learning about Pol Pot's reign and the Cambodian genocide, I knew about the Khmer Rouge by proximity to my Western understanding of the Vietnam War, but I honestly had no idea what Cambodia was going through at the time. And when I found out about it, I don't remember how, I think it was through a documentary, I was just completely shocked that I had never heard about this in high school or even in my undergraduate years taking humanities courses or anything like that. It was just insane. Again, if you would like to learn more about the Cambodian genocide, I will leave links to the aforementioned books and documentaries in the description. But I thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye bye.